Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, by Reza Aslan. Chapter 3. You know where I am from. Ancient Nazareth rests on the jagged brow of a windy hilltop in Lower Galilee. No more than 100 Jewish families live in this tiny village. There are no roads, no public buildings. There is no synagogue. The villagers share a single well from which to draw fresh water. A single bath, fed by a trickle of rainfall captured and stored in underground cisterns, serves the entire population. It is a village of mostly illiterate peasants, farmers, and day laborers, a place that does not exist on any map. The homes in Nazareth are simple affairs, a single windowless room divided in two, one room for the family, the other for the livestock, made of whitewashed mud and stone and crowned with a flat-topped roof, where the householders gather to pray, where they lay out their wash to dry, where they take their meals on temperate evenings, and where, in the hot summer months, they roll out their dusty mats and sleep. The lucky inhabitants have a courtyard and a tiny patch of soil to grow vegetables, for no matter their occupation or skill, every Nazarene is a farmer. The peasants who call this secluded village home are, without exception, cultivators of the land. It is agriculture that feeds and sustains the meager population. Everyone raises their own livestock. Everyone plants their own crops. A bit of barley, some wheat, a few stalks of millet and oats. The manure collected from the animals feeds the earth, which in turn feeds the villagers, who then feed the livestock. Self-sufficiency is the rule. The hillside hamlet of Nazareth is so small, so obscure, that its name does not appear in any ancient Jewish source before the 3rd century CE. Not in the Hebrew Bible, not in the Talmud, not in the Midrash, not in Josephus. It is, in short, an inconsequential and utterly forgettable place. It is also the city in which Jesus was likely born and raised. That he came from this tightly enclosed village of a few hundred impoverished Jews may very well be the only fact concerning Jesus' childhood, about which we can be fairly confident. So identified was Jesus with Nazareth that he was known throughout his lifetime simply as the Nazarene. Considering how common a first name Jesus, Yeshua, was, the city of his birth became his principal sobriquet. It was the one thing about which everyone who knew him, his friends and his enemies alike, seemed to agree. Why then do Matthew and Luke, and only Matthew 2:1-9, and Luke 2:1-21, claim that Jesus was born not in Nazareth but in Bethlehem, even though the name Bethlehem does not appear anywhere else in the entire New Testament, not even anywhere else in Matthew or Luke, both of which repeatedly refer to Jesus as the Nazarene, save for a single verse in the Gospel of John, 7:42. The answer may be found in that verse from John. It was, the evangelist writes, early in Jesus' ministry. Up to this point, Jesus had, for the most part, restricted himself to preaching his message to the poor farmers and fishermen of Galilee, his friends and neighbors. But now that the Feast of Tabernacles has arrived, Jesus' family urge him to travel with them to Judea to celebrate the joyous harvest festival together and to reveal himself to the masses. Come, they say, show yourself to the world. Jesus refuses. You go, he tells them. I am not going to this festival. It is not yet my time. Jesus' family leave him behind and head off to Judea together. Yet unbeknownst to them, Jesus decides to follow them down to Judea after all, if for no other reason than to secretly roam through the assembled crowd and hear what people are saying about him. He is a good man, someone whispers. No, he is leading the people astray, says another. Sometime later, after Jesus has revealed himself to the crowd, a few begin to make guesses about his identity. Surely he is a prophet. And then someone finally says it. Everyone is clearly thinking it. How could they not be? What with Jesus standing tall amid the crowd, declaring, how are they to understand such heretical words? Who else would dare to say such a thing openly and within earshot of the scribes and the teachers of the law, many of whom, we are told, would like nothing more than to silence and arrest this irksome preacher? This man is the Messiah. This is no simple declaration. It is, in fact, an act of treason. In first-century Palestine, simply saying the words, "This is the Messiah," aloud and in public, can be a criminal offense punishable by crucifixion. True, the Jews of Jesus' time had somewhat conflicting views about the role and function of the Messiah, fed by a score of messianic traditions and popular folk tales that were floating around the Holy Land. Some believed the Messiah would be a restorative figure who would return the Jews to their previous position of power and glory. Others viewed the Messiah in more apocalyptic and utopian terms, as someone who would annihilate the present world and build a new, more just world upon its ruins. There were those who thought the Messiah would be a king, and those who thought he'd be a priest. The Essenes apparently awaited two separate messiahs, one kingly, the other priestly, though most Jews thought of the Messiah as possessing a combination of both traits. Nevertheless, among the crowd of Jews gathered for the Feast of Tabernacles, there seems to have been a fair consensus about who the Messiah is supposed to be and what the Messiah is supposed to do. He is the descendant of King David. He comes to restore Israel, to free the Jews from the yoke of occupation, and to establish God's rule in Jerusalem. To call Jesus the Messiah, therefore, is to place him inexorably upon a path already well trodden by a host of failed messiahs who came before him, toward conflict, revolution, and a war against the prevailing powers. Where that path would ultimately lead, no one at the festival could know for sure, but there was some sense of where the path must begin. Does not the scripture say that the Messiah is of David's seed? Someone in the crowd asks. That he comes from the village where David lived, from Bethlehem? But we know where this man comes from, claims another. Indeed, the crowd seems to know Jesus well. They know his brothers, who are there with him. His entire family is present. They traveled to the festival together from their home in Galilee, from Nazareth. Look into it, says a Pharisee with the confidence that comes from a lifetime of scrutinizing scriptures. You will see. The prophet does not come out of Galilee. Jesus does not dispute their claim. Yes, you all know me, he admits, and you know where I am from. Instead, he deflects the matter of his earthly home entirely, choosing instead to emphasize his heavenly origins. I have not come here on my own. The one who sent me is true, and he, who you do not know. But I know him, I am from him. He is the one who sent me. John 7, 1-29. Such statements are commonplace in John, the last of the four canonized Gospels, composed between 100 and 120 CE. John shows no interest at all in Jesus' physical birth, though even he acknowledged that Jesus was a Nazarene. John 18, 5-7. In John's view, Jesus is an eternal being, the Logos who was with God from the beginning of time, the primal force through whom all creation sprang and without whom nothing came into being. John 1:3. A similar lack of concern about Jesus' earthly origins can be found in the first Gospel, Mark, written just after 70 CE. Mark's focus is kept securely on Jesus' ministry. He is uninterested either in Jesus' birth or, perhaps surprisingly, in Jesus' resurrection, as he writes nothing at all about either event. The early Christian community appears not to have been particularly concerned about any aspect of Jesus' life before the launch of his ministry. Stories about his birth and childhood are conspicuously absent from the earliest written documents. The Q material, which was compiled around 50 CE, makes no mention of anything that happened before Jesus' baptism by John the Baptist. The letters of Paul, which make up the bulk of the New Testament, are wholly detached from any event in Jesus' life save his crucifixion and resurrection, though Paul does mention the Last Supper. But as interest in the person of Jesus increased after his death, an urgent need arose among some in the early Christian community to fill in the gaps of Jesus' early years and, in particular, to address the matter of his birth in Nazareth, which seems to have been used by his Jewish detractors to prove that Jesus could not possibly have been the Messiah, at least not according to the prophecies. Some kind of creative solution was required to push back against this criticism, some means to get Jesus' parents to Bethlehem so that he could be born in the same city as David. For Luke, the answer lies in a census. In those days, he writes, there came a decree from Caesar Augustus that the entire Roman world should be registered. This was the first registration to take place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. Everyone went to his own town to be registered. Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the city of David. Then, in case his readers may have missed the point, Luke adds, because Joseph belonged to the house and the lineage of David. Luke 2, 1-4. Luke is right about one thing and one thing only. 10 years after the death of Herod the Great, in the year 6 CE, when Judea officially became a Roman province, the Syrian governor, Quirinius, did call for a census to be taken of all the people, property, and slaves in Judea, Samaria, and Idumea. Not the entire Roman world, as Luke claims, and definitely not Galilee, where Jesus' family lived. Luke is also wrong to associate Quirinius' census in 6 CE with the birth of Jesus, which most scholars place closer to 4 BCE, the year given in the Gospel of Matthew. However, because the sole purpose of a census was taxation, Roman law assessed an individual's property in the place of residence, not in the place of one's birth. There is nothing written in any Roman document of the time, and the Romans were quite adept at documentation, particularly when it came to taxation, to indicate otherwise. Luke's suggestion that the entire Roman economy would periodically be placed on hold as every Roman subject was forced to uproot himself and his entire family in order to travel great distances to the place of his father's birth, and then wait there patiently, perhaps for months, for an official to take stock of his family and his possessions, which, in any case, he would have left behind in his place of residence, is, in a word, preposterous. What is important to understand about Luke's infancy narrative is that his readers, still living under Roman dominion, would have known that Luke's account of Quirinius's census was factually inaccurate. Luke himself, writing a little more than a generation after the events he describes, knew that what he was writing was technically false. This is an extremely difficult matter for modern readers of the Gospels to grasp, but Luke never meant for his story about Jesus' birth at Bethlehem to be understood as historical fact. Luke would have had no idea what we in the modern world even mean when we say the word history. The notion of history as a critical analysis of observable and verifiable events in the past is a product of the modern age. It would have been an altogether foreign concept to the Gospel writers, for whom history was not a matter of uncovering facts, but of revealing truths. The readers of Luke's Gospel, like most people in the ancient world, did not make a sharp distinction between myth and reality. The two were intimately tied together in their spiritual experience. That is to say, they were less interested in what actually happened than in what it meant. It would have been perfectly normal, indeed expected, for a writer in the ancient world to tell tales of gods and heroes whose fundamental facts would have been recognized as false, but whose underlying message would be seen as true. Hence Matthew's equally fanciful account of Jesus' flight into Egypt, ostensibly to escape Herod's massacre of all the sons born in and around Bethlehem, in a fruitless search for the baby Jesus, an event for which there exists not a shred of corroborating evidence in any chronicle or history of the time, whether Jewish, Christian, or Roman. A remarkable fact considering the many chronicles and narratives written about Herod the Great, who was, after all, the most famous Jew in the whole of the Roman Empire, the king of the Jews no less. As with Luke's account of Quirinius's census, Matthew's account of Herod's massacre was not intended to be read as what we would now consider history, certainly not by his own community, who would surely have remembered an event as unforgettable as a massacre of its own sons. Matthew needs Jesus to come out of Egypt for the same reason he needs him to be born in Bethlehem, to fulfill the scattered prophecies left behind by his ancestors for him and his fellow Jews to decipher, to place Jesus in the footsteps of the kings and prophets who came before him, and, most of all, to answer the challenge made by Jesus' detractors that this simple peasant who died without fulfilling the single most important of the messianic prophecies, the restoration of Israel, was in fact the anointed one. The problem faced by Matthew and Luke is that there is simply no single cohesive prophetic narrative concerning the Messiah in the Hebrew Scriptures. The passage from the Gospel of John quoted above is a perfect example of the general confusion that existed among the Jews when it came to the messianic prophecies. For even as the scribes and teachers of the law confidently proclaimed that Jesus could not be the Messiah because he is not, as the prophecies demand, from Bethlehem, others in the crowd argue that the Nazarene could not be the Messiah because the prophecies say, "When the Messiah comes, no one will know where he is from." John 7:27. The truth is that the prophecies say both things. In fact, were one to take the advice given to the festival crowd by the skeptical Pharisee and look into it, one would discover a host of contradictory prophecies about the Messiah, collected over hundreds of years by dozens of different hands. A great many of these prophecies are not even actual prophecies. Prophets such as Micah, Amos, and Jeremiah, who appear to be predicting the coming of a future salvific character from the line of King David that would one day restore Israel to its former glory, are in fact making veiled criticisms of their current king and the present order, which the prophets imply have fallen short of the Davidic ideal. There is, however, one thing about which all the prophecies seem to agree. The Messiah is a human being, not divine. The idea of a divine Messiah is anathema to Judaism, which is why, without exception, every text in the Hebrew Bible dealing with the Messiah presents him as performing his messianic functions on earth, not in heaven. So then, if you wish to fit your preferred messianic candidate into this jumbled prophetic tradition, you must first decide which of the many texts, oral traditions, popular stories, and folk tales you want to consider. How you answer that question depends largely on what it is you want to say about your Messiah. Matthew has Jesus flee to Egypt to escape Herod's massacre, not because it happened, but because it fulfills the words of the prophet Hosea. "Out of Egypt I have called my son." Hosea 11:1. The story is not meant to reveal any fact about Jesus. It is meant to reveal this truth, that Jesus is the new Messiah who survived Pharaoh's massacre of the Israelites' sons and emerged from Egypt with a new law from God. Exodus 1:22. Luke places Jesus' birth in Bethlehem not because it took place there, but because the words of the prophet Micah, "And you, Bethlehem, from you shall come to me a ruler in Israel." Micah 5:2. Luke means that Jesus is the new David, the King of the Jews, placed on God's throne to rule over the Promised Land. Simply put, the infancy narratives in the Gospels are not historical accounts, nor were they meant to be read as such. They are theological affirmations of Jesus' status as the anointed of God, the descendant of King David, the promised Messiah. That Jesus, the eternal Logos from whom creation sprang, the Christ who sits at the right hand of God, you will find swaddled in a filthy manger in Bethlehem, surrounded by simple shepherds and wise men bearing gifts from the east. But the real Jesus, the poor Jewish peasant who was born sometime between 4 BCE and 6 CE in the rough and tumble Galilean countryside, look for him in the crumbling mud and loose brick homes tucked within the windswept hamlet of Nazareth.